1914. Europe moved to war with drums, flags, and confidence. Men marched through city streets beneath arches of flowers. Crowds cheered and believed this would be quick, clean, and glorious. No one yet understood that they were stepping into the machine age of death. Within weeks, the romance of war dissolved in mud and wire. Cavalry charges met machine gun fire. Brilliant uniforms turned brown beneath rain and blood. Generals still drew arrows on maps as if it were 1870, but the ground no longer obeyed the general's imagination. Barbed wire, artillery, and automatic weapons made movement suicidal. The front solidified into a scar across the continent, from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, a line that refused to move. By Christmas, the dead already numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Each army blamed its own caution, its own mistakes, its own bad luck. None yet realized the truth. The world itself had changed. Human courage could no longer defeat machine precision. Trenches became cities. Whole populations lived underground. Mud swallowed boots and bodies alike. Rats thrived. Men aged 10 years in a month. The thunder of artillery never ceased. Day and night blended into one long vibration of fear. In this new world, innovation meant survival, but innovation was the one thing the armies could not imagine. Generals ordered more of everything. More shells, more men, more bravery. But bravery had no answer for geometry. To reach the enemy's trench, a soldier had to cross 100 yards of open ground under machine gun fire that could cut down an army in minutes. Barbed wire turned every step into a death sentence. The battlefield had become a problem of physics, not morale. In London, in Berlin, in Paris, inventors and officers began sketching strange ideas on scraps of paper. Some dreamed of giant shields on wheels. Others imagined armored tractors or motorized battering rams. Most of these ideas were dismissed as fantasy. The military mind, born in the age of horses and bayonets, could not picture steel replacing flesh. But among those dreamers, a few refused to let the idea die. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, a British officer and engineer with a restless mind. He had witnessed the power of the machine gun in the Boer War and knew that something entirely new was needed to overcome it. In late 1914, Swinton watched as British attacks in France were shredded by fire, and a thought took root. If men could not survive crossing no man's land, perhaps a machine could. He wrote a memorandum proposing armored vehicles on continuous tracks, engines wrapped in steel capable of rolling over trenches and crushing barbed wire. He imagined them carrying guns in their sides, moving with infantry, protecting them from fire. To modern ears, it sounds obvious. At the time, it sounded insane. Swinton's proposal was passed around, commented on, and quietly shelved. The British Army was led by men who had grown up on horseback. They trusted courage, not combustion engines. To them, Swinton's machine was a child's toy, a distraction from the real business of war. One general scribbled on the margin, "Interesting, but fanciful." But Swinton did not stop. He knew what he had seen, an entire generation dying in mud because no one dared to think differently. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the French were experimenting with armored cars that could barely move off paved roads. In Germany, a few engineers whispered similar ideas, but the high command refused to listen. Everywhere, the old world clung to its traditions even as those traditions bled out in the trenches. By 1915, the stalemate had hardened into something monstrous. Every offensive cost tens of thousands of lives for a few hundred yards of ground. The British Army had learned how to kill, but not how to move. And in the headquarters of the War Office, the very idea of mobility had become heresy. Yet in the shadow of that bureaucracy, a handful of officers and civilians began to gather. Men of the Navy, not the Army. Among them was a young, restless politician named Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill had a gift for seeing opportunity in madness. He read Swinton's ideas and was intrigued. To Churchill, the problem of the trenches was an engineering problem, not a moral one. If ships could carry armor and guns across the sea, why not across the land? Churchill assembled a small secret committee at the Admiralty, the Landships Committee. It was a name chosen to sound ridiculous, to hide what they were really doing. Their task, to design a vehicle that could bring movement back to the battlefield. They were not soldiers, they were sailors and engineers. That was precisely why they might succeed. The Navy understood machinery, propulsion, armor, and steel. And so, behind locked doors, in a haze of tobacco, smoke, and secrecy, the first sketches of the modern tank began to take shape. The early discussions bordered on the absurd. Some proposed rolling fortresses the size of houses. Others imagined mechanical centipedes or self-propelled shields. But amid the noise, two minds began to align. Walter Gordon Wilson, a mechanical genius from the Navy, and William Tritton, an industrial engineer from the firm William Foster and Company in Lincoln. Wilson brought the theory, gears, engines, and clutches. Tritton brought the workshop, the hammers, and the will to build. Together, they would transform sketches into steel. In December 1914, their factory began modifying an agricultural tractor built by the Holt Company of America. The Holt machine used continuous tracks, an American invention designed for farming, and it could move over rough ground where wheels would sink. It was crude, heavy, and slow, but it offered a foundation. They built armored shells over it, experimented with steering, added guns, and argued every step of the way. Nothing like it had ever existed, and no one knew how it should look. At first, their creations were grotesque. Engines overheated. Tracks snapped. Steering was impossible, but the engineers kept going. They were driven by the same fury that haunted the trenches, the knowledge that men were dying for nothing. If they could make this machine work, perhaps it could end the slaughter. While Wilson and Tritton labored, Swinton fought a political war in London. He needed money, men, and most of all, permission. Every proposal met resistance. The cavalry generals laughed openly in meetings. They asked, "How will you feed these monsters? How will you get them to France?" They called him the Mad Major behind his back. But Swinton understood something his superiors did not, that madness is often just innovation without patience. In early 1915, the first prototype took shape in Lincoln. It was called Little Willie, part humor, part camouflage. It was a box of riveted steel on tracks, with a small turret and an underpowered engine. It weighed more than 16 tons and could barely reach 3 miles per hour. But when it moved across the test field, crushing obstacles and grinding through mud, those who watched felt something close to awe. It was not perfect, but it moved. And movement had become the rarest thing in war. The prototype was far from battle-ready. It couldn't cross wide trenches, and it overheated after a few minutes. But Wilson and Tritton refused to quit. They extended the chassis, reshaped the hull into a long diamond, and placed cannons inside sponsons instead of a turret. This new machine could climb out of craters and cross gaps twice its length. They called it Mother. Every tank that came after would trace its ancestry back to her. All of this unfolded in secrecy. Even the workers in the factory were told lies. They were building water tanks for Mesopotamia, they were told. A cover story invented to hide the project from spies and skeptics alike. And so the code word tank became the name that would outlive them all. In the meantime, the war devoured another 1,000,000 men. The Second Battle of Ypres saw the first use of poison gas. Verdun became a slaughterhouse that lasted 10 months. The Somme, that green valley in France, was churned into a wasteland of bone and mud. Armies were running out of everything but corpses. By late 1915, the pressure to find a miracle was unbearable. The generals no longer laughed at Swinton's machines, but they still did not believe. They needed proof. They demanded a demonstration. On a cold morning, the prototype Mother rumbled across a test field before a crowd of officers, the air filled with smoke and the stink of oil. The engine coughed, gears screeched, but the steel giant moved, steady, relentless, unstoppable. It climbed over trenches, flattened fences, and crossed ground that would have swallowed a regiment. When it stopped, the silence was deafening. One observer whispered, "Gentlemen, we may have just won the war." Most said nothing. They didn't know what they had seen. Churchill watched with satisfaction. Swinton, Wilson, and Tritton exchanged weary smiles, but they knew this was only the beginning. The machine worked in theory. Now it had to work in hell. The British High Command finally gave permission for production. They ordered a small number of the new land ships to be built. Factories that had been making tractors and trains were retooled to forge armor and gears. The workforce grew, secrecy deepened. The men in the trenches knew nothing. But in workshops across England, history was turning on a lathe. And yet, even as they built, doubt persisted. Would the tanks sink in mud? Would they break down? Could they even reach the front before the war ended? Every answer was uncertain, but one fact was clear. The war was not ending, and no one else had a better idea. As 1916 began, the Allies planned a massive offensive on the Somme River. They believed that enough artillery could break the German line once and for all. They were wrong, but they didn't know it yet. Among the thousands of guns, shells, and soldiers being prepared for the assault, a handful of strange machines were quietly shipped to France, disguised, covered, secret even from the men who would follow them. They would be tested in the crucible of the Somme, a battlefield already soaked with a generation's blood. The machines were new, the idea was untested, the outcome would change the future of war. For now, though, the front remained frozen. In every trench, men stared across the wire at an enemy they could almost touch but never reach. They waited for orders, for luck, for deliverance. They waited for movement. Somewhere behind them, in a factory in Lincoln, a machine was being born, a strange, clanking child of desperation and genius. Soon, it would crawl out of the shadows and into history. The men in the trenches could not know it yet, but the age of steel had already begun. The war that froze was about to move again. By the spring of 1915, the war had already devoured Europe's youth. The optimism of that first summer had rotted in the mud of Flanders and the dust of Champagne. Every nation was exhausted, yet none could stop. They were trapped by pride, by alliances, by the illusion that one last push would bring victory. And in the middle of this madness, a few men dared to think differently. In the city of Lincoln, England, inside the workshops of William Foster and Company, the sound of hammers echoed day and night. Steam hissed from engines. Sparks fell like fireflies. Among the factory workers, rumors spread. They were building something unusual, something secret. Some said it was a mobile water tank for the desert. Others whispered it was an armored car for the Navy. The truth was stranger than either. The man overseeing the work was William Ashbee Tritton, a 38-year-old engineer with the temperament of a blacksmith and the imagination of a poet. He had been building agricultural machinery for years, but now he was building something that might end the bloodletting in France. With him was Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson, a naval officer turned inventor. Wilson was quiet, methodical, brilliant. He understood machinery in the same way a musician understands notes. Together, these two men would shape the first creature of modern war. Their task was almost impossible. They were told to build a machine that could move over trenches, crush barbed wire, carry guns, and withstand machine gun fire. It had to be fast enough to keep up with infantry, light enough to cross bridges, and cheap enough to build in numbers. And it had to work on ground so churned and cratered that horses broke their legs just trying to walk. No one had ever built anything like it. No one even knew if it could be done. But Tritton and Wilson shared something that most of their military overseers lacked: curiosity. They believed that if you could imagine it, you could build it. Failure was only a step between blueprints. Their first attempt, Little Willie, was a strange-looking creature, a squat, box-shaped machine sitting on two sets of continuous tracks. Inside, a six-cylinder engine roared like a trapped beast. It had armor, it had guns, it could move, but only just. It weighed too much for its engine, and when it tried to cross a trench, the front simply fell in. The idea was right, but the shape was wrong. They learned by breaking things. When Little Willie failed, they tore it apart and started again. They stretched the hull until it looked absurdly long. They added track plates that wrapped around the entire body like a metal belt. They mounted cannons on the sides, not the front, to avoid sinking into craters. And with each experiment, they were inching closer to a miracle. The next prototype, Mother, was born in early 1916. She was longer, heavier, and stronger. When she rolled over a ditch at the test field, the earth itself seemed to bow before her. She could climb walls taller than a man. For the first time, an engine could do what flesh could not. Those who witnessed her trials would never forget the sight. A 30-ton monster crawling over mud and timber, groaning like a ship at sea, leaving crushed earth in her wake. Smoke billowed from her exhaust like breath from some iron dragon. It was magnificent and terrifying all at once. But outside those secret fields, few people even knew such a thing existed. Secrecy was vital. If Germany learned that Britain was building armored landships, they might develop their own, or worse, destroy them before they could reach the front. The entire project operated under a veil of deception. When government officials discussed the machines, they called them tanks, short for water tanks, to hide their purpose. The name was meant to be temporary, a piece of misdirection. Yet it stuck. The name became the symbol of a revolution. In London, Ernest Swinton fought a quieter war. He wrote reports, gave lectures, and argued endlessly with generals who did not understand him. He was not an engineer, but he understood the battlefield. He knew that machines could only change the war if generals were willing to change their minds, and that, he found, was the hardest battle of all. Swinton wrote, "The tank was not born in the workshop, but in the trenches." He meant that desperation, not inspiration, was its real father. Every day, telegrams arrived at the War Office listing tens of thousands of casualties. Each offensive failed for the same reason. Men could not move faster than bullets. The tank was not a weapon of aggression. It was a shield that moved. While engineers built prototypes, politicians schemed and argued. The Landships Committee was disbanded in late 1915, its members reassigned or dismissed. But the seed they had planted took root in the War Office. The Army, once openly hostile, began to take notice. They had run out of alternatives. By early 1916, the first production order was placed, 100 machines based on Mother's design. Factories in Birmingham, Newcastle, and Lincoln began building the components. Steel, engines, gears, and tracks poured into secret depots. The 1st Tank Battalion was formed, the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps. Its men were volunteers, mostly mechanics and drivers. They trained in the English countryside, far from prying eyes under code names and false orders. Even they did not fully understand what they were preparing for. Their training ground was Elveden, in Suffolk, where the fields were carved into mock trenches. The recruits learned to start, steer, and repair the monstrous machines. Engines overheated, tracks jammed. Exhaust filled the cabins until the men coughed black smoke. They learned that driving a tank was not like driving anything else. It was part engineering, part endurance, part faith. Inside, it was hell. The idiot noise was deafening, the heat unbearable. When shells struck the armor, splinters of hot metal ricocheted inside like shrapnel, cutting through clothing and flesh. To protect themselves, the crews wore chainmail masks, leather jackets, and goggles. Medieval armor reborn for a modern nightmare. They were called tank men, but they felt like prisoners inside their own machines. Still, they believed in the idea. They called their vehicles by names that sounded half affectionate, half fearful: Creeper, Crusher, Crusader. Each tank was a new experiment, a promise, and a gamble. And soon, that gamble would be tested in battle. Back in the War Office, Winston Churchill's career had already taken a hit after the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. He had been dismissed from the Admiralty and forced into political exile, but his fingerprints were still on the tank project. Though he no longer had the power to command it, the machines he had once protected were moving toward their destiny, and he would live to see his mad idea vindicated. Meanwhile, in Germany, the High Command still believed that the war could be won by artillery and courage alone. They dismissed reports of British armored engines as propaganda. They trusted their trenches, their machine guns, and their gas. But the quiet birth of the tank was something new under the sun, an invention that belonged to no single nation, but to necessity itself. As production continued, the first tank crews were assembled into units. Each crew consisted of 8 men: driver, commander, gunners, mechanics. They learned to live inside the machine for hours at a time, sweating, deafened, and half blind. They developed a strange camaraderie, something between madness and pride. When they spoke of the war to come, they called themselves land sailors, steering iron ships across an ocean of mud. Every detail had to be invented from nothing. How to load ammunition inside, how to signal, how to coordinate with infantry. There were no manuals, only trial and error. And for every tank that ran, another broke down. But each failure was a step forward. In June 1916, the machines were loaded onto ships under armed guard. They were covered in tarps, labeled water containers for Russia. Even the dock workers who loaded them had no idea what they were. The crews followed soon after, disguised as an engineering unit. Their orders were to await deployment on the Somme. On the morning of September 15th, 1916, they would go into battle for the first time. But for now, as they crossed the Channel, they were still part of a secret too strange to believe. They were soldiers carrying the future, hidden beneath canvas. For Tritton and Wilson, watching from England, the feeling was bittersweet. They had built something that had no name when it began, and no guarantee it would work. They had fought bureaucracy, ridicule, and exhaustion. Now their creation was leaving their hands forever. Whatever happened next, history would decide if they were geniuses or fools. In the trenches of the Western Front, the soldiers waiting for the Somme offensive knew nothing about the new machines. They only knew that they were about to attack again, that the generals promised this time would be different, that the shelling had gone on for days, and that the ground itself had been pulverized into dust. They had heard those promises before. What they could not imagine was that far behind them, engines were already warming, engines that would change everything. In the summer twilight, as the sun set over the ruined fields of France, a few officers looked out at the endless horizon and wondered how to break the deadlock. They did not know that salvation was already on the move, clanking, roaring, crawling, coming for the wire. In the darkness of the British docks, a sentry walked his post, unaware that behind the steel plates under his boots lay a revolution in waiting. The first tanks stood silent, like sleeping giants. Their crews slept beside them, dreaming of what they would soon unleash. They didn't know what awaited them, only that they were part of something new, something no soldier in history had ever seen. And somewhere, deep in the mind of a dismissed politician and a handful of stubborn engineers, the impossible had already become inevitable. They had given war a new shape, and in doing so, they had changed the destiny of every battle to come. They did not know it yet, but their machines would crawl into legend.